The first time Grace Graves heard footsteps on her front porch after her husband's death, she reached for the shotgun before she reached for the door, and that told her everything about the kind of year it had been. It was the spring of 1878, in the high, dry country of Wyoming Territory, where the town of Cedar Flat clung to the base of the Wind River foothills like a burr caught in a horse's mane. The Cedar Flat Mining Company ran 3 silver shafts into the mountainside, and the town had grown up around the payroll the company paid out every month, the way a garden grows up around a well. Grace's husband, Thomas Graves, had ridden guard on that payroll for 2 years, a steady, careful man who checked his cinch twice and his conscience 3 times, or so he used to say with a crooked smile that Grace had loved since she was 17 years old. 8 months earlier, on a cold October night, Thomas had been found on the Cheyenne Road with 2 bullets in him and no payroll box in sight. He had lived only long enough to be carried home, and the words he had managed before he died had made no sense to anyone but Grace, who had held his hand and heard him whisper, "Under. I put it under. Tell no one, Gracie. Tell no one till it is safe." Then he was gone, and the town of Cedar Flat had decided, in the way that frightened people often decide things, that Thomas Graves had stolen $8,000 of mining company silver and either hidden it before his partners in crime killed him, or run off with accomplices who had then turned on him. Nobody asked Grace what she thought her husband's dying words meant. Nobody much asked Grace anything at all anymore, except the banker, who asked her every month whether she had the payment, and the answer was always no. She was 26 years old that spring, and she had grown thin in the way that grief and worry together make a woman thin, not gaunt exactly, but pared down to what mattered. She kept chickens and a small garden and took in mending from the few women in town who were not too proud, or too frightened of what the men might say, to bring their torn shirts to the widow Graves. She had a milk cow named Clementine, and a rifle she had learned to shoot better than most men in the county, and she had a homestead 40 acres wide with a house Thomas had built with his own hands the year they married, a good square house with a wraparound porch that had once been the pride of the whole valley, and was now sagging on its east corner like an old man's shoulders. It was that porch, in fact, that brought Micah Garrison to her door. He came into Cedar Flat on a bay gelding with a Confederate cavalry saddle worn soft with age, though he had fought for the Union, having grown up in Kansas before the war took him east, and then west again in search of something he had never quite named to himself. He was 32, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with sun-weathered skin and pale gray eyes that had seen enough of the world to be careful with what they showed. He had no family left in Kansas worth writing to, no ranch of his own, and no particular destination beyond the next town with work in it. He had heard in Laramie that Cedar Flats Mining Company sometimes hired extra hands for the summer digging season, and so he had ridden 3 days through sage and rock to find out if it was true. It was true, but the foreman at the mine, a narrow-faced man named Vernon Slade, had looked Micah over with a kind of measuring suspicion that Micah did not care for, and told him to come back in a week when the summer crew was hired on. In the meantime, a man needed to eat, and eating required money, and so Micah had gone into the Cedar Flat Mercantile to ask if anyone in town needed carpentry work done, since he had learned that trade from his father before the war, and it had kept him fed in worse places than this one. The mercantile owner, a stout, kind-faced woman named Ruth Calloway, had looked at him for a long moment before she said, "There is a widow out on the Sweetwater Road, name of Grace Graves, whose porch is falling down around her ears, and not a man in this town will lift a hammer for her on account of her husband." What did her husband do? Micah had asked, because it seemed the natural question. "They say he stole the mine payroll and got himself killed hiding it," Ruth Calloway said, lowering her voice as though the words themselves might be dangerous. "I never believed it myself. Thomas Graves was as honest a man as ever forked a horse, But folks believe what is easy to believe, Mr. Garrison, and it was easier to believe him a thief than to wonder who really took that money. Micah had turned that over in his mind while he rode out to the Sweetwater Road that same afternoon, following Ruth Calloway's directions past a dry creek bed and a stand of cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. He did not consider himself a man who went looking for trouble, but he had never much cared for the sound of a whole town deciding a dead man's guilt without a trial, and there was something in him, some old stubborn thing his father had put there, that wanted to see the widow's porch and judge the matter for himself. He found the house sitting square and proud despite its sagging corner, white clapboard gone gray with weather, a good stone chimney, a garden turned fresh for spring planting. And he found Grace Graves standing in the yard with a shotgun leveled at his chest, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her jaw set in a way that told him she had leveled that shotgun at strangers before and meant business every time. "That is close enough," she said. Micah reined in the bay and raised both hands slow and easy, the way he might have approached a spooked colt. "Ma'am, my name is Micah Garrison. Ruth Calloway at the Mercantile sent me. Said you had a porch needed fixing, and I have got a hammer and some know-how, if you are willing to hire a hand." Grace studied him without lowering the shotgun. She had learned in 8 months of widowhood that men who came around asking questions or offering favors usually wanted something more than they said, whether it was the deed to her land, or an answer about the payroll they thought she was hiding, or something uglier that she did not like to think on when she was alone in the house after dark. But this man's hand stayed up, and his eyes stayed steady, and there was something in his voice, a plainness, an unhurried honesty that made her lower the barrel an inch. "I cannot pay you but $1 a day in my cooking," she said, "and my cooking is only fair." $1 a day and fair cooking sounds like a bargain to me," Micah said, and something that was almost a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "I have eaten worse for less." She looked at him a moment longer, weighing him the way she weighed every stranger now, and then she lowered the shotgun the rest of the way and rested the stock against her hip. "The porch is on the east side. It has been rotting out since before winter. I would have fixed it myself, but I do not have the lumber, and I do not have anyone in town who will sell it to me on credit." "Well," Micah said, swinging down from the bay, "let us have a look at it, and we will see what can be done." That was the beginning of it, though neither of them knew it yet, standing in that dusty yard with the spring wind moving through the cottonwoods and a shotgun no longer between them. The porch, when Micah got down on his knees to examine it, was worse than rotten. The support posts on the east corner had been eaten through by some kind of ground moisture, and when he pressed his hand against the main crossbeam, it gave like wet bread. He whistled low. "Whoever built this did fine work," he said, running his hand along a section that was still sound. "But this end has been sitting in standing water every spring thaw for years, I would guess. You are lucky it has not come down on somebody already. Thomas built it the year we married," Grace said, and there was a catch in her voice she did not quite manage to hide. 19 years old, both of us, and he was so proud of that porch. Said a man ought to be able to sit on his own porch of an evening and watch the sun go down over land that was his." Micah glanced up at her, and something in her face, the particular grief of a young woman widowed too soon, struck him harder than he expected. He had seen grief before, plenty of it in the war and after, but there was something about the way she held herself, straight-backed and dry-eyed, refusing to let the sorrow bend her, that he found he admired before he had even decided to. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Graves," he said quietly. "Whatever this town believes about your husband, I did not know him, and I do not put much stock in a story I have only heard second-hand." Grace's eyes met his, searching, as though she were trying to decide whether he meant it or whether it was only a kindness offered to smooth the way toward a day's wait. What she found in his gray eyes must have satisfied something in her, because her shoulders came down a fraction, and she said, "Most folks around here have already made up their minds. It is a rare thing to meet a man who has not. I try not to make up my mind about a fellow until I have walked a mile in his boots, Micah said. Now, about this porch. I'm going to need to pull up these floorboards and dig out these rotted posts down to good ground before I can set new ones. It will take a few days, and it will make a mess of your yard before it makes anything better. I have got nothing but days, Grace said, and for the first time since he had ridden up, something like the ghost of a smile touched her mouth. Come inside first. You will want coffee before you start tearing up my porch. Over the following days, Micah Garrison became a fixture on the Graves homestead, arriving each morning at first light and working until the sun dropped behind the western ridges. He pulled up the rotted floorboards of the porch one by one, stacking the salvageable ones and setting aside the ruined ones for kindling. And Grace found herself, almost against her own better judgment, looking forward to the sound of his hammer and the particular way he whistled old trail songs under his breath while he worked. She brought him coffee at mid-morning and again in the afternoon, and though she told herself it was only good manners, only what any decent person would do for a hired hand, she began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with manners at all. The way his forearms corded when he swung the mallet. The patient, careful way he explained to her why a joint needed to be cut just so, as though her understanding mattered to him. The gentleness with which he had, on the second day, stopped his work entirely to help her chase down an escaped chicken, laughing so hard at his own clumsiness in the attempt that she had laughed too, the first real laugh she could remember since October. On the third day, Micah began digging out the rotted support posts, working a spade down into the earth on the east corner of the porch, where the water damage was worst. It was slow, careful work because the posts had been set deep, and he did not want to disturb the foundation stones beneath them any more than necessary. Grace had gone inside to start supper, a rabbit stew she had been simmering since noon, when she heard the spade strike something that was not dirt and was not stone. "Mrs. Graves," Micah called, and there was something in his voice, an odd, careful note that brought her to the door with flour still on her hands. "You had better come look at this." She came out onto the ruined porch, picking her way across the exposed joists, and knelt beside the hole Micah had dug. There, half buried in the dark earth beneath where the corner post had stood, was the corner of a metal box, iron-banded, rusted at the edges but solid, the kind of strongbox used to haul coin and currency over rough country. Grace felt the blood leave her face. She knew, in the way a body knows things before the mind can catch up, exactly what that box must contain, and exactly what it would mean for her, for Thomas's memory, for everything she had spent 8 months trying to hold together. "Do not touch it yet," she whispered, though Micah had made no move to. "Micah, I think that is the payroll. I think that is what they have been looking for. What everyone in that town believes my husband stole." Micah sat back on his heels and looked at her, and then at the box, and then at her again, and she could see him working through the same terrible arithmetic that was running through her own mind. If the payroll had been buried here beneath their own porch all this time, while the town called Thomas Graves a thief and Grace his accomplice or his dupe, what did that mean about how he had died and why? "We had better dig it the rest of the way out," Micah said finally, "and we had better do it careful, and we had better think hard before we say one word of this to anybody in Cedar Flat, until we understand what we are looking at." It took the better part of an hour, working with the spade, and then with their bare hands once the box was mostly free, to lift the strongbox out of the earth. It was heavier than Grace had expected, and when Micah forced the rusted latch with the flat of his hunting knife, the lid groaned open to reveal neat stacks of currency and a scattering of silver coin, more money than Grace had seen in one place in her entire life. Beneath the money, folded flat against the bottom of the box, was an oilcloth packet, and inside that packet, protected from 8 months of damp earth, was a single folded sheet of paper covered in Thomas Graves's careful, familiar handwriting. Grace's hands shook so badly that Micah had to help her unfold it, and together, Kneeling in the ruined porch with the spring light fading gold across the yard, they read the last words Thomas Graves had ever written. To whoever finds this, and I pray to God it is my grace and no one else, I have done a terrible thing, and I do not know if it was the right one. I have taken the September payroll of the Cedar Flat Mining Company, $8,000, and hidden it here beneath our porch, and put false weight of stones and sand into the company's strongbox in its place. I did this because I overheard Vernon Slade, the company bookkeeper, speaking with two men I did not know, planning to rob the payroll shipment on the Cheyenne Road this very week, and dividing up shares as though the robbery had already happened. I do not know who else at the company may be involved, and I did not know who I could trust to tell. I feared that if I went to the sheriff, Slade might learn of it before I could act, being that Sheriff Pruitt and Slade are known to play cards together most every Saturday night. So I took the real money and hid it, meaning to ride to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne myself and lay the whole matter before him, a man with no ties to this town who could investigate proper. If anything happens to me before I can do this, know that I did it to protect what was right, and to protect you, Gracie, and I am sorry, so sorry if my caution has cost me more than I meant to pay. I love you more than these words can say. Tell our story true if you ever get the chance. Your Thomas. Grace did not remember afterward exactly how long she knelt there on the broken porch with the letter in her hands, and the tears running silent down her face. She remembered Micah's arm coming around her shoulders, steady and warm, not pulling her close so much as simply being there, a solid presence against which she could finally, after 8 months of holding herself upright through sheer stubborn will, allow herself to lean. He was not a thief, she said at last, her voice raw. He was trying to stop one. He died trying to do the right thing, and this whole town has spent 8 months spitting on his grave for it. Not any more they have not, Micah said, and there was something hard and certain in his voice that had not been there before. Grace, this letter tells us who really planned that robbery. This is proof. We are going to see this made right, I promise you that. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it even through her grief, the way a small thing can lodge itself in the heart even in the midst of larger sorrows. They sat together on the porch steps as the light failed, the strongbox between them, the letter carefully refolded and tucked inside Grace's apron pocket, and they talked long into the evening about what should be done. Grace wanted to ride straight to Sheriff Pruitt with the letter and the money, but Micah, ever careful, ever measuring, reminded her of what the letter itself said. If Sheriff Pruitt and Vernon Slade are card-playing friends, then taking this evidence straight to Pruitt might be the same as taking it straight to Slade, he said. We do not know how deep this goes. We need to get this letter and this money to someone outside of Cedar Flat, someone who has got no reason to protect Slade or anybody else in this town. The territorial marshal, Grace said slowly, in Cheyenne. That is who Thomas meant to go to. Then that is who we go to, Micah said. But Grace, listen to me. If Slade finds out that this box has been found before we can get it to Cheyenne, he is not going to sit still and let the truth come out. A man who would set up a robbery and let another man take the blame for it, and maybe even arrange to have that man killed on the road, is not a man who is going to hesitate to do something desperate if he thinks he is about to be found out. Grace felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. You think Slade had Thomas killed? I think it is a strong possibility, Micah said gently. And I think until we are safely away from Cedar Flat with this evidence, you and I both need to be careful who we talk to, and careful about what we say, and careful about strangers riding up to this house asking questions. That night, for the first time since Thomas's death, Grace did not sleep alone in her fear. Micah, without being asked, took his bedroll and set it on the newly rebuilt section of the porch, near enough to hear if anything stirred in the yard, and Grace lay awake in her bed listening to the small, comforting sounds of another person nearby, a person who had, in the space of a few short days, become someone she trusted with the most dangerous secret of her life. The next morning they made their plans. Cheyenne was 3 days' ride south and east, across open country that Micah did not know well but that Grace, having grown up in this territory, could navigate by memory of the old freight roads. They could not simply load the strongbox onto a wagon and drive out of Cedar Flat in broad daylight, not without inviting exactly the kind of attention they were trying to avoid. Instead, they decided they would wait for the cover of an early morning departure before the town was properly awake, and they would take only what they could carry on horseback, the money divided between saddlebags, the letter kept safe on Grace's person where no thief could easily find it. But before they could put their plan into action, trouble found them first. It was mid-afternoon, and Micah was back at work on the porch, this time setting the new support posts he had cut and shaped over the preceding days, when a rider came up the Sweetwater Road at a hard trot, raising a plume of dust that Grace saw from the kitchen window before she heard the hoofbeats. She came out onto the porch, her heart already hammering, and saw that it was Vernon Slade himself, thin and sharp-featured atop a rangy black horse, with Sheriff Otis Prout riding just behind him, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache and a badge that caught the afternoon light. "Micah," Grace said quietly, and he was already setting down his hammer, already stepping to where he had left his gun belt hanging on a porch post, though he did not draw the weapon, only made certain it was within reach. Slade reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, not bothering to dismount, and looked from Grace to Micah with an expression of careful, cold appraisal. "Mrs. Graves," Slade said, his voice smooth as poured oil, "I hope we are not interrupting anything. Sheriff Prout and I were riding this way and thought we would pay a call." "You have never paid a call on me before, Mr. Slade," Grace said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Not in 8 months." "Well, that is true enough," Slade said, and his pale eyes flicked toward the torn-up section of the porch, toward the fresh-dug earth still visible near the new support posts, and Grace felt her stomach drop because there was no mistaking the sudden sharpening of his attention, the way a hunting dog goes still at the scent of something in the brush. "Doing some repairs, I see. About time. This old porch has been an eyesore for years." "A man's got to earn his keep somehow," Micah said easily, stepping forward with his hands loose at his sides, putting himself, Grace noticed, in a position between her and the two riders without seeming to make any particular effort of it. "Micah Garrison. I am working for Mrs. Graves this week." "Garrison," Slade repeated as though tasting the name for falseness. "You would be the drifter who came asking after work at the mine a few days back." "That is right. Funny thing," Slade said, and his smile did not reach his eyes at all. "Man rides into town looking for honest work, and inside a week he is out here digging up a dead thief's porch. Makes a fellow wonder what he might be digging for." The words hung in the air, sharp as a drawn blade, and Grace felt Micah go very still beside her. "I am fixing a porch, Mr. Slade," Micah said, his voice still even, still calm, though Grace could hear the steel beneath it now. "That is all. If you have got some other notion in your head, I would be obliged if you would say it plain, instead of hinting around at it in front of a widow woman." Sheriff Prout, who had said nothing thus far, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, and Grace caught the quick, uneasy glance he threw toward Slade, the look of a man who was not entirely comfortable with wherever this conversation might be heading. It confirmed, in Grace's mind, something Thomas's letter had only suggested, that Prout might be weak or foolish, or simply too fond of card games and easy friendships to see clearly, but that Slade was the one truly driving whatever was happening here. "No notion at all," Slade said, and his smile widened, thin and unpleasant. "Just an observation, Mr. Garrison. This is a small town. People notice things. A stranger showing up right around planting season, taking up work at the one homestead in the county everybody has been wondering about for the better part of a year. Folks will talk." "Let them talk," Grace said, finding her voice at last, and there was more steel in it than she had known she still possessed. "I have had this whole town talking about me and my husband for 8 months, Mr. Slade, and not one word of it has ever been kind or fair or true. I have got nothing left to fear from talk." Something flickered across Slade's face, gone almost before Grace could be certain she had seen it, a flash of something that might have been anger or might have been calculation, or might have been the particular unease of a guilty man testing the ground beneath a threat he could not yet see clearly. He gathered his reins and turned his horse's head back toward the road. "Well," he said, "we will not keep you from your work. Good day, Mrs. Graves, Mr. Garrison." Sheriff Prout touched his hat brim in a gesture that was almost apologetic, and the two men rode back the way they had come, and Grace and Micah stood together on the half-finished porch and watched them go, neither one speaking until the dust of their passage had settled back into the road. "He suspects something," Grace said finally. "He does," Micah agreed grimly. "And that means we cannot wait for a proper morning departure. Grace, we need to leave for Cheyenne tonight, under cover of dark, before Slade has time to decide what he is going to do about his suspicions." They spent the remaining hours of daylight in careful, urgent preparation. Grace packed what supplies they would need for the 3-day ride, hard bread and dried meat, and a small skillet, while Micah saw to the horses, checking hooves and cinches with the meticulous care of a man who understood that their lives might depend on the soundness of their tack before this journey was through. The strongbox itself was too heavy and too conspicuous to carry whole, so they transferred its contents into 2 sets of saddlebags, dividing the money and hiding it beneath a layer of Grace's mending supplies and Micah's spare shirts, the letter itself sewn by Grace's careful hand into the lining of her own coat, close against her heart, where she was determined no one would find it without finding her first. As the sun set behind the western ridges, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise, Grace stood in the doorway of the house Thomas had built and looked back at it, wondering if she would ever see it again, wondering if this desperate ride to Cheyenne would restore her husband's good name and her own security, or whether it would end in tragedy on some lonely stretch of prairie road, the way Thomas's own desperate honesty had ended 8 months before. "Are you ready?" Micah asked, coming up beside her with both horses saddled and waiting. "No," Grace admitted, "but I am going anyway." "That is the only kind of ready that has ever mattered," Micah said, and something in the quiet warmth of his voice steadied her more than any promise of safety could have. They rode out just after full dark, following the old freight road south along the base of the foothills, keeping off the main road where they could and choosing quieter tracks known to Grace from her girlhood, when her own father had run cattle in this country before the mines came and changed everything. The night was clear and cold. The stars spread thick overhead in a way Grace had always found both beautiful and lonely, and she found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected, for the steady presence of Micah Garrison riding beside her, his silhouette dark against the star-scattered sky, his rifle resting across his saddle bow in easy readiness. They spoke little in those first hours of riding, both of them listening for sounds of pursuit, both of them carrying the weight of what they knew and what they risked. But somewhere around midnight, when they stopped to rest the horses beside a trickling creek, Grace found herself telling Micah about Thomas, about the boy she had married at 17, about the porch he had built with such pride, about the particular way he used to hum while he worked, off-key and cheerful, a habit Grace had teased him about for years and now missed with an ache that had not lessened with time, only changed shape. "He sounds like he was a good man," Micah said quietly, sitting beside her on a flat rock while the horses drank. "He was the best man I ever knew," Grace said. "Until now, I think." The words slipped out before she quite meant them to, and she felt her face heat even in the darkness, embarrassed at her own boldness, but Micah did not laugh, did not tease, only looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite read in the dim light. "Grace," he said, and her name in his voice had a different weight to it now than it had before. "I do not want you to think I came into your life to replace what you lost. I know that is not a thing that can be replaced. But I will tell you true, these last few days working on your porch, getting to know you, I have felt something I have not felt in a long while, maybe not ever, and I do not rightly know what to do with it, given everything else that is happening." "Neither do I," Grace admitted. "But I know that I am glad you were the one who came looking for work that day, and not some other man. I know that whatever happens when we reach Cheyenne, I do not think I could have found the courage to make this ride alone." "You would have found it," Micah said. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met. But I am glad I do not have to find out for certain, and I am glad I am here beside you instead of somewhere else." They rode on through the remainder of that night and into the gray hours of dawn, stopping only when the horses needed rest. And by the second day, Grace found herself watching the trail behind them with increasing unease, a prickling sense that they were being followed, though she could point to nothing certain to justify the feeling. It was Micah who spotted the dust first, midway through the second afternoon, a thin plume rising from the road behind them, where no dust ought to have been if they were truly alone in this empty country. "Riders," he said, reining in and turning to study the distant haze. "2, maybe 3, coming on steady, not hard but steady, like men who know where they are going and are not in a hurry to catch us before they are ready." "Slade," Grace said, her voice tight with fear. Maybe just other travelers on the same road, but I would rather not wait around to find out which." Micah studied the terrain around them, the rolling hills broken by outcrops of pale sandstone and stands of scrub cedar, and pointed toward a narrow draw that cut away from the main road toward higher ground. "There is a way we can cut off some distance and put some rock between us and whoever that is. It will be rougher going, but it might buy us the time we need to reach Cheyenne first." They left the main road and pushed their horses up through the draw, the going rough and slow, loose rocks shifting beneath the horses' hooves, both riders leaning low to avoid low branches that caught at their clothes and their hats. Grace's heart hammered with every stumble of her mare, every scrape of hoof on stone, imagining pursuers closing the distance behind them, imagining what might happen if Slade's men caught them here in this empty country with no witnesses and no help within a day's ride. They came out of the draw as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, onto a stretch of high ground that gave them a clear view back the way they had come. And there, perhaps 2 miles distant on the main road, Grace saw 3 riders moving at a hard trot, the lead rider's coat catching a flash of late sunlight that glinted off something metal, a rifle barrel or a badge, she could not tell which. "That is them," Micah said grimly. "And they have picked up their pace. I think they know we left the road." "How far to Cheyenne?" Grace asked, fighting to keep the panic out of her voice. "Another half-day's ride, maybe less if we push the horses. But Grace, listen to me. If those are Slade's men, and if they catch us before we reach town, this could go very badly. I want you to understand that whatever happens, if it comes to a fight, you get yourself to Cheyenne and to the marshal's office, and you let me worry about anything that happens on the road." "I am not leaving you to face 3 men alone," Grace said fiercely. "I am not asking you to be brave, Grace. I am asking you to be smart. That letter and that evidence needs to reach the marshal no matter what happens to either one of us. If I fall behind, you ride on. Do you understand me?" Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she could not bear the thought of riding away and leaving him to face danger alone. Not after everything. Not when whatever this feeling was that had grown between them over these past days had become something she was not ready to lose. But she also understood the terrible logic of what he was saying, understood that Thomas's sacrifice would mean nothing if his letter and the stolen payroll never reached the men who could set the record straight. "I understand," she said, though the words tasted bitter as ash. They pushed their horses hard through the remaining hours of daylight, following a rough track that Grace half remembered from childhood trips with her father, a shortcut that cut across a shoulder of high ground and rejoined the main road much closer to Cheyenne than the route their pursuers were taking. By the time full dark fell, they could no longer see the riders behind them, though Grace could not shake the feeling of being watched, hunted, the sensation crawling along her spine like a living thing. It was near midnight when Micah's horse, exhausted from the hard pace, stumbled on a loose stone and went down hard, throwing Micah clear but catching his leg beneath its weight for one terrible moment before the animal scrambled back up, favoring its right foreleg badly. Micah! Grace was off her own horse in an instant, kneeling beside him in the darkness, her hands moving over him in the dim starlight, checking for injury with a fear that surprised her with its intensity. "I am all right," Micah said, though his voice was tight with pain as he pushed himself upright. "Ankle is twisted, maybe, nothing broken, I do not think. But this horse cannot carry me any further tonight, not at any kind of pace. Grace, listen, you have to go on without me." "No," Grace said, and there was no argument left in her voice this time, only certainty. "I am not leaving you injured in the middle of nowhere with armed men somewhere behind us. We will go slower if we have to, but we go together. Grace, the evidence is sewn into my coat and hidden in these saddlebags, and it will still be there whether we ride fast or slow," Grace said fiercely. "I have already buried one man I loved because he thought protecting me mattered more than staying alive to be with me. I am not doing that again, Micah Garrison. Not for you, not for anybody." The words hung between them in the cold night air, and Grace realized, with a kind of startled clarity, exactly what she had just admitted, exactly what feeling had prompted such fierce words. Micah looked at her for a long moment, his face pale with pain but his eyes bright with something that was not only gratitude. "I love you too, Grace," he said quietly. "I did not mean to. It happened faster than I know what to do with. But there it is, plain as I can say it, and I do not care who is chasing us or what happens tomorrow. I wanted you to know it tonight." Grace felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. Grief and joy tangled together in a way she had not thought possible, mourning Thomas and loving Micah both at once, and understanding, somehow in that moment, that one did not have to cancel out the other, that her heart had room enough for both the man she had lost and the man she had found. "We had better get you back on a horse," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "because I intend for both of us to still be alive to talk about this properly once we reach Cheyenne." They rode double on Grace's mare for the remaining hours of that night, moving slower than either of them liked, but moving steadily nonetheless, leading the injured gelding behind them, and dawn found them cresting a final rise to see the scattered lights of Cheyenne spread out below them in the gray morning light. The town larger and more solid than anything Cedar Flat could boast, a proper territorial capital with brick buildings and a telegraph line, and most important of all, the office of the United States Marshal for the territory of Wyoming. They rode into town as the sun was fully up, exhausted, filthy with trail dust, Micah's ankle swollen and painful inside his boot, and made their way directly to the marshal's office, where a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a face weathered by 20 years of frontier law enforcement looked up from his desk with an expression of frank curiosity at the sight of them. "Marshal Everett Holbrook," the man introduced himself, rising from his chair. "You two look like you have ridden through hell to get here. What can I do for you?" Grace, her hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline both, drew Thomas's letter from the lining of her coat and set it on the marshal's desk, along with the packet of currency she had carried, close against her body, for the entire desperate journey. "My name is Grace Graves," she said, "and I believe my husband was murdered 8 months ago to cover up a robbery planned by Vernon Slade, the bookkeeper of the Cedar Flat Mining Company, and I have proof." Marshal Holbrook read Thomas's letter twice through, his expression growing graver with each line, and examined the currency Grace laid before him, comparing serial markings against a ledger he pulled from a locked drawer, a ledger that had apparently been sent to his office months before by the mining company itself, as part of an initial, half-hearted investigation into the robbery that had produced no useful results. "This is a serious accusation, Mrs. Graves," Holbrook said finally, "but I will tell you plainly, this letter and this money matches every detail the company reported missing, right down to a particular stamped mark on these silver dollars that came from a special minting the company requested for that shipment. If your husband's account is true, and I have got no strong reason yet to doubt it, then Vernon Slade has got a great deal to answer for. There is more, Micah said, and he told the marshal about the visit from Slade and Sheriff Prout, about the suspicious pursuit on the road from Cedar Flat, about the possibility that Prout himself might be complicit, or at least willfully blind, to whatever Slade had done. Marshal Holbrook listened to all of it with the careful attention of a man who had heard many stories in his years of service and had learned to separate the true from the false, and when Micah and Grace had finished, he rose from his desk with the air of a man who had made up his mind. "I will telegraph ahead to have a deputy watch the roads out of Cedar Flat, in case Slade tries to run," he said. "And I will ride out myself with a proper posse to bring Mr. Slade in for questioning, and to have a serious conversation with Sheriff Prout about the nature of his duties. In the meantime, Mrs. Graves, Mr. Garrison, you both look like you have not slept in 2 days, and there is a hotel 2 streets over that serves a decent breakfast. I would suggest you avail yourselves of both a bed and a meal while I see to this business, and I will send word when there is news to report." It took 3 more days for that news to come, 3 days during which Grace and Micah rested in Cheyenne, tending to Micah's swollen ankle and Grace's frayed nerves, 3 days during which they walked together through the streets of the territorial capital, sharing meals and quiet conversation, allowing themselves, for the first time since the discovery beneath the porch, to simply be 2 people falling in love without the shadow of pursuit hanging over them. They talked of everything and nothing during those 3 days, of Micah's boyhood in Kansas and his years riding for the Union cavalry, of Grace's girlhood on her father's cattle ranch before the mines came, of small hopes and small fears, of what it might mean to build a life together once this business with Slade was finally settled. Micah confessed that he had been drifting for years without any real sense of where he belonged, moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, never quite finding a place that felt like home, and that something about Grace, and about the stubborn, proud, grieving strength of her, had made him think for the first time in a long while about putting down roots. "I do not have much to offer a woman," he said one evening, as they sat together on a bench outside the hotel watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "No ranch of my own, no fortune, just a good horse and 2 working hands and whatever wages I can earn." "Thomas did not have much either when we married," Grace said. "Just a homestead claim and a strong back and a stubborn belief that he could build something worth having. I do not need fortune, Micah. I have had fortune's absence teach me what actually matters." "And what is that?" he asked, turning to look at her in the fading light. "Someone who will stand beside me when things go hard," Grace said softly, "and laugh with me when things go easy, and tell me the truth even when it is not comfortable. Someone who sees me, not just what happened to me or what people say about me, but me." Micah reached over and took her hand, his rough carpenter's fingers closing gently around hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because nothing more needed saying. On the 4th day, Marshal Holbrook returned to Cheyenne with news that confirmed everything Thomas's letter had suggested. Vernon Slade had indeed attempted to flee Cedar Flat upon learning of the marshal's approach, but had been apprehended on the Laramie Road by the deputy Holbrook had telegraphed ahead. Caught with a bag containing several $100s, he had apparently been skimming from the mine's accounts over a period of years, evidence that dovetailed neatly with the larger scheme Thomas had uncovered. Under questioning, and faced with the overwhelming evidence of Thomas's letter and the recovered payroll, Slade had eventually confessed to the full scheme. He had indeed planned the robbery with 2 hired men from outside the territory, intending to split the stolen payroll and blame the loss on outlaws, using the confusion to cover years of smaller embezzlements he had been conducting against the mining company's books. When Thomas Graves had overheard the planning and taken action to thwart it by hiding the real money and substituting a decoy, Slade's hired men had ambushed Thomas on the road as planned, only to discover the strongbox contained worthless stones. Believing Thomas had discovered their plot and hidden the real money somewhere, and enraged at being cheated of their prize, the two hired men had shot Thomas in a desperate attempt to force him to reveal the location before he died of his wounds, an admission chillingly reflected in his own dying words to Grace. Slade himself had not been present for the shooting, but had orchestrated the entire scheme and had subsequently spread the rumor that Thomas Graves was the thief, both to protect himself from suspicion and to explain away the missing money in a manner that would not implicate his own hired men. Sheriff Otis Prout, for his part, was found to have known nothing of the robbery scheme itself, though the marshal's investigation revealed he had been willfully negligent in pursuing any serious inquiry into Thomas's death, preferring the easy explanation that let him avoid conflict with a man, Slade, whose company controlled much of the town's economy and whose friendship Prout valued more than he ought to have. Prout was relieved of his position as sheriff, though no criminal charges were brought against him, and he left Cedar Flat within the month for a fresh start in Montana territory, his reputation, if not his liberty, in ruins. Vernon Slade was tried at the territorial court in Cheyenne that summer, and the evidence against him, anchored by Thomas Graves's own letter and the testimony of the two hired gunmen, who turned against Slade in exchange for lighter sentences, was overwhelming. He was convicted of murder as an accessory and of grand larceny, and sentenced to a long term at the territorial prison, a sentence that satisfied Grace far less than the simple, profound relief of hearing her husband's name spoken in that courtroom not as a thief, but as the honest man he had always been, a man who had died trying to prevent a crime rather than commit one. When the trial concluded, and the town of Cedar Flat learned the full truth of what had happened, there was a reckoning of a different sort, quieter but no less significant. Ruth Calloway at the Mercantile was among the first to ride out to the Graves homestead to apologize in person for ever having doubted Thomas, bringing with her a basket of preserves and an offer of credit at the store for as long as Grace needed it. Others followed in the weeks after, neighbors who had shunned Grace for 8 long months now finding their way to her door with apologies and small kindnesses, awkward but sincere, the town's collective conscience working itself out one uncomfortable visit at a time. Grace accepted these apologies with more grace than many would have managed, understanding, in her own hard-won wisdom, that fear and easy assumption were common failings, and that the important thing now was not to nurse old grievances, but to build something new. The mining company, eager to distance itself from Slade's crimes and to make some public amends, quietly forgave the outstanding loan against Grace's homestead, and at Marshal Holbrook's private suggestion, awarded her a portion of the recovered payroll as recognition of Thomas's actions in preventing a much larger theft, calling it, in the company's official statement, a reward for the bravery and honesty of a loyal employee wrongly maligned. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to clear every debt against the homestead and leave a comfortable cushion besides, enough for Grace to finally stop counting every penny with the particular desperate arithmetic of a woman one bad month from losing everything. Micah Garrison, for his part, found himself with an offer of steady work at the Cedar Flat mine once the summer digging season began, the same foreman position Slade had once held now filled by a decent, careful man named Arthur Whitfield, brought in from the company's Denver office, who had heard the story of Micah's role in exposing the fraud, and offered him a position as the mine's new payroll guard and assistant bookkeeper. Trusting a man who had proven his integrity under real pressure, far more than any stranger with mere paper credentials. But it was the quieter, more personal reckoning that mattered most to Grace, the slow, careful courtship that unfolded over the summer months following their return from Cheyenne. As Micah finished the repairs to her porch, this time with sound lumber and proper drainage, so that no water would ever again pool beneath those support posts. And as the two of them, freed at last from danger and suspicion both, allowed themselves to simply fall in love in the ordinary, unhurried way that Grace had once thought she would never experience again. Micah took a room in town at first, out of respect for propriety, but he came out to the Graves homestead most every evening after his work at the mine was done, and the two of them would sit together on that rebuilt porch, watching the sun go down over land that Grace was determined, this time, would remain hers no matter what came. And they would talk, and sometimes they would not talk at all, content simply to sit in comfortable silence with their hands joined between them. It was on just such an evening, in early September, nearly 5 months after Micah had first ridden into Grace's yard with a shotgun leveled at his chest, that he asked her to marry him. He did not have a ring, not yet, having spent what savings he had helping to fund their journey to Cheyenne and the weeks that followed, but he had something better, he told her. A small wooden box he had carved himself in the evenings after work, containing a folded piece of paper on which he had written, in his own plain but careful hand, a promise. "I am not a poet, Grace," he said, his voice rough with a nervousness that touched her deeply, this steady, careful man suddenly unsteady in her presence. "I do not have fine words the way some men might. But I love you, plain and true, and I have loved you since I do not rightly know when, somewhere between fixing that porch and riding beside you to Cheyenne and back. I want to build a life with you here, on this land your husband loved, in this house he built, and I want to be a father to whatever children we might be blessed with, and I want to grow old sitting beside you on this very porch, watching the sun go down for the next 50 years if the good Lord allows it. Grace Graves, will you marry me?" Grace, tears streaming freely down her face, tears that held both the last echoes of old grief and the full bright joy of new love, did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. Yes, Micah Garrison, 1,000 times yes. They were married in October, 1 year almost to the day after Thomas's death, in a small ceremony at the Cedar Flat Church, the same church where Grace had once sat through 8 months of whispered accusations and averted eyes, now filled instead with neighbors who had come to wish her well, Ruth Calloway weeping happily in the front pew, Marshall Hallbrook having ridden down from Cheyenne specially to attend, standing as witness alongside the new foreman Arthur Whitfield. Grace wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and carried a small bouquet of late wildflowers gathered from the very hillside where Thomas had once taken her courting, all those years before. And if there was a bittersweet edge to marrying beneath the shadow of that memory, Grace found she did not mind it, understanding that love, real love, did not require the erasure of what came before, only the courage to build something new upon its foundation. The preacher, an elderly circuit rider named Reverend Josiah Combs, who had known Thomas Graves personally and had spoken more than once, quietly and to little effect, against the town's rush to judgment in the months following his death, offered a blessing over the couple that acknowledged, gently but directly, the injustice Grace had endured. "This town failed Grace Graves and her husband once," Reverend Combs said, addressing the small congregation with a gravity that silenced even the restless children in the back pews. "We were quick to believe the worst of a man who deserved our trust, and slow to offer comfort to a widow who deserved our compassion. Let today stand as a reminder that judgment rushed is judgment often wrong, and let the joy we celebrate here be also a promise that this community will be slower to condemn and quicker to love in the years ahead." There was not a dry eye among the gathered guests by the time the Reverend pronounced Grace and Micah husband and wife, and the celebration that followed, held in the Cedar Flat Town Hall with tables groaning under the weight of dishes brought by neighbors eager to make amends through the old frontier language of shared food, lasted well into the evening, with fiddle music and dancing and toasts offered by half the town. Grace and Micah settled into married life on the homestead, with the particular joy of two people who had each known enough hardship to properly treasure the peace that followed it. Micah continued his work at the mine, well respected now, trusted with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible to imagine for the drifter who had ridden into Cedar Flat with nothing but a horse and a set of carpenter's tools. Grace kept the homestead, her garden flourishing that first spring of their marriage more abundantly than it had in years, and took on fewer mending jobs now that the family's finances were secure, though she never entirely gave up the work, finding satisfaction in the skill of her own two hands that had carried her through the darkest months of her life. In the spring following their marriage, Grace discovered she was expecting a child, and the news brought a joy to the household that Micah later confessed he had not believed himself capable of feeling, having spent so many years as a solitary wanderer that the prospect of fatherhood had seemed, for most of his adult life, a distant and unlikely thing. Their son, whom they named Thomas Micah Garrison in honor of both the man who had built the porch beneath which such a dangerous secret had lain hidden, and the man who had helped uncover it, was born in the depths of the following winter, a healthy, loud, dark-haired boy who took, from his earliest days, to being carried out onto that same porch by his father in the evenings, bundled against the cold, to watch the sun go down over the mountains. A small ritual that Micah insisted upon even in the coldest weather, saying that a boy ought to learn early to appreciate the beauty of the land he would one day call home. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Ruth, after Ruth Calloway, whose early kindness had set in motion the whole chain of events that led to Grace's happiness, a fitting tribute that brought the older woman to tears when she learned of it, and cemented a friendship between the two families that would last the rest of their lives. The porch itself, rebuilt that first spring with sound lumber and proper care, stood solid and true for decades afterward, weathering countless Wyoming winters and blooming springs, a physical testament to the love that had been discovered, quite literally, beneath its boards. Grace kept Thomas's letter always, tucked safely in a cedar box alongside her wedding photograph with Micah, and the small carved wooden box containing his written proposal, a private shrine to both the love she had lost and the love she had found, understanding in her own wise and generous heart that a person's capacity for love was not a finite thing to be spent and exhausted, but something that could grow and multiply, honoring the past even while building toward the future. In the years that followed, Cedar Flat grew and changed, as mining towns of that era often did, the silver eventually giving way to other industries as the deposits played out. But the Garrison homestead remained, passed down eventually to young Thomas and his own children, the porch rebuilt once more by his own hands in the early years of the new century, using lumber his father had taught him to select and shape with the same careful attention Micah himself had learned from his own father. So many years before, in a different territory, in a different life, before a shotgun-wielding widow and a buried strongbox had changed the whole course of his existence. Grace Graves Garrison lived to a fine old age, long enough to see her grandchildren playing in the same yard where she had once knelt in the fading light of a spring evening, and read her first husband's last letter with trembling hands, long enough to tell the story of that discovery so many times that it became a kind of local legend, the tale of the missing payroll and the honest guard who died protecting it, and the drifter carpenter who helped uncover the truth and found love in the process. She never tired of telling it, and Micah, who lived alongside her for over 40 years of marriage until his own peaceful passing in his sleep at the age of 74, never tired of hearing her tell it, always reaching for her hand at the same point in the story, when she described the moment she had first lowered that shotgun and let a stranger onto her land, as though even after 4 decades of marriage, he still marveled at his own good fortune in having been that stranger, and in having found, beneath the boards of a broken-down porch and the ashes of an old injustice, the truest love of his life. And so it was that on quiet evenings, even into her final years, Grace Garrison would sit on that same rebuilt porch, watching the sun sink behind the same mountains that had witnessed both her deepest sorrow and her greatest joy. And she would think of Thomas, gone so long now but never forgotten, and of Micah, sleeping now in the town cemetery beside her own future resting place, and of the strange and terrible and ultimately beautiful chain of events that had brought love into her life not once but twice. And she would feel, in her old and grateful heart, that whatever hardships this wild country had asked of her, it had in the end given back tenfold in the form of a good name restored, a homestead saved, children and grandchildren to carry her story forward, and a love so deep and so true that it had grown, quite literally, from the very ground beneath her feet.